This is, I can't count how many SBSs I've done in this island or other places. I've been teaching for YWAM for 35 years. Jesse mentioned that I've been teaching since I was 16. That's 50 years now. I'm 66 this month. So I've been teaching for half a century. I have no formal training. I began in the Jesus movement, which was a revival of especially young people in Southern California back in 1970. I was already a Christian. I had been raised in a Christian home. I received Christ as a child. And I'm going to move something here. There we go. So, in the Jesus movement, I was 16, and that's when I got baptized in the Holy Spirit. I was a Baptist before that. And I had already preached in the pulpit of the Baptist church as a leader of the youth group. I had done a lot of evangelism, not very effectively, but I had a zeal for God and yet no power until I was baptized in the Spirit in 1970. And because I had a background as a Christian, and most of the people who were saved in the movement were new converts out of a pagan background, most of them had been hippies, and it was a kind of a movement of converted hippies to a very large degree, not entirely. But a lot of these people just really didn't have any real understanding of the Bible. What they knew was kind of a New Age kind of orientation. So there was a real desperate need for people who could teach the Bible. And I didn't see myself as a person who could teach the Bible, but in high school, the Jesus people students in my high school would get together at lunchtime, and we would talk about the things of God. We'd talk about the Scripture. Eventually, the others in that group asked if I would teach them, and so I began teaching every day at lunchtime in my senior year until I graduated. After that, I just continued because the Jesus movement continued, and I've just never quit. My grandmother, when I graduated from high school, offered to pay my full tuition to go through a Bible college in Southern California, a particular one that she liked. I didn't choose to do it for two reasons. One, we were quite sure the rapture was going to happen any moment because we were told that was true by older Christians who we trusted. And a second one was I didn't want to cut my hair. This particular Bible college would make me cut my hair. At the time, my hair was quite long, and I didn't want to comply. So those were very spiritual reasons for not going to Bible college. But also, I really felt that I would learn more on my own. Because in Bible college, I'd be restricted to certain hours of classes, certain hours of study, and other things. But if I wasn't in Bible college, I could read the Bible 24/7 almost, every waking hour. That's not quite 24/7, but that was a lot of hours per day. And so for many years, I just read the Bible and taught it because there were many opportunities. When I was 18, I was teaching 9 times a day. 9 times a week. Obviously, I was teaching every day, plus every night and some days. So I was busy. The Jesus movement had plenty of work to do if you were a Bible teacher. I started my own school in 1983, and the next year I started teaching for YWAM. Or maybe it was the year before that. No, the year after. I've been teaching for YWAM for 35 years. Started out teaching DTSs, which I sometimes still teach, but I mostly teach SBSs, DBSs, and as last week in Honolulu, the BCC courses, which are all Bible courses based on the SBS. So I'm teaching books of the Bible more often than topics for YWAM these days. And so I've done Romans here at this SBS several times in the past. And so it's really, it never gets old. Since I teach all the books of the Bible, people sometimes ask me, what's your favorite book of the Bible to teach? And honestly, I have to say it's whichever one I'm teaching at the moment. I have 5 children. If someone said, which is your favorite of your children, I'd have to say whichever one I'm thinking of at the moment, which is true. And same with the books of the Bible. Every one of them, when you're thinking about it, when you're looking at it, for the moment, it's my favorite anyway. And the Bible's just that way. And no matter how many times you read it, or no matter how many times I teach it, it's always, for me, fresh. But the challenge is to make it fresh for students, and to, especially take a book like Romans, which is so important, one of the most important books of the New Testament. I know for many people it is their favorite book of the New Testament. I would put maybe one of the Gospels in that position rather, but the book of Romans is the great epistle of Paul. It is an epistle that sparked the Reformation. Now, the Reformation might have happened if the book of Romans didn't exist, but we'll never know. It was the book of Romans, which was being taught by Martin Luther as a Catholic monk in a university in Wittenberg, Germany. He was teaching Romans, and as he studied Romans, he realized that the just shall live by faith, and that eventually worked into his conscience and into his mind in such a way that he had to challenge much of what he had taught and been taught as a Roman Catholic, and he is, of course, famous for having begun the Reformation, and it was the book of Romans that caused that. One of the great movements in England that actually many historians say prevented England from being destroyed, or at least falling to a revolution like the French Revolution, which was a bloody and a very negative result that they had. England was in danger of the same thing around that time, but John and Charles Wesley and the revivals that took place through their preaching were... Oh, that's a good idea, yeah. Dana doesn't like it looking up my nose. We're live streaming this so my wife can watch. She has heard me teach Romans before, and every other book probably many times, but she still likes to be able to critique the current one. So I'm live streaming to Facebook. That's probably better. Sure. So, but John and Charles Wesley, their revival began pretty much through the conversion of John Wesley, which was also through hearing a preacher preaching on the book of Romans. And Luther and Wesley really are very, very important people in modern church history, and their conversions go back to their study of or hearing the book of Romans. Now, the interesting thing is there's a lot of different opinions, well, not a lot, but there's at least more than one opinion about what Romans is really getting at. And my understanding of Romans used to be very much probably like that which Luther taught after his conversion. But I have to say that I was challenged in it once by Ron Smith when I was teaching at the SBS up in Makapala, probably, it must have been 1985 or so, before you were born. And I taught Romans, and I remember I was teaching through, and I read verse 14, when the Gentiles who do not possess, this is chapter 2, 14, when the Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts. Now, what I taught about that is what every commentator in the world I ever heard taught about it. Namely that Paul is saying that the Gentiles, who are pagans, though they don't have the law, they do have some conscience. They do have some awareness that God gives to every man of what's right and wrong. And you do see even pagan societies in some measure recognizing standards of righteousness that agree with the law. For example, every society has laws against murder and theft and so forth. They don't obey them, but they have those laws. They recognize those standards. So I was just teaching from that verse, as frankly every commentator you'll ever pick up does, and said this shows that even the Gentiles who are not converted, who don't know the law, have an internal awareness of the law. And I taught that, and I remember seeing Ron Smith out in the parking lot when he was on his way somewhere, and we crossed paths, and he said, Steve, sometime I'd like to have a time to talk to you a little more about your doctrine that the Gentiles who aren't saved have the law written in their hearts. I said, well, that's not my doctrine. That's like every teacher in Romans teaches that. And he said, well, where else in the Bible would it say that unconverted people have the law written in their hearts? And he had to leave. He got in his car and drove off, and we never had that conversation, so I have no idea what he was getting at, except as a Calvinist, I know that he doesn't believe, probably, that unconverted people have the light of the gospel in their hearts, or maybe morality, I'm not sure. But his question got me thinking, where does it say elsewhere that unconverted people have the law written in their hearts? And I realized that reference to the law written in the hearts is obviously from Jeremiah 31 about the new covenant. And it's quoted in 2 Corinthians 3, it's quoted in Hebrews chapters 8 and 10. Both places talk about God will write his law in the hearts of those who are connected to him in the new covenant, which is Christians. And so I thought, well, maybe Ron's right. Maybe this isn't talking about unbelievers. But if it is talking about believing Gentiles, then why? Why would he be saying that here? And what does that mean about his whole argument? And that got me looking at Romans a different way. And I honestly don't know. I haven't talked to Ron about Romans since then, but I don't know if he sees it this way or another way. But so I didn't get this from him, but it was his comment that sparked my interest in looking at something very differently. Because I had been taught, and this is what most commentators teach, that Romans is like an evangelistic tract. That Paul is mainly interested in defending the doctrine of justification by grace through faith, and basically sort of like a tract for people to read and get saved. Well, sure enough, a lot of people have read Romans and gotten saved, so it seems to have that effect. But commentators usually said, and I used to say too, that Romans is not like the other epistles of Paul. Paul's other epistles, you know, he is writing to some circumstance in the churches. When he writes 1st and 2nd Corinthians, there's specific problems in those churches that he's addressing. When he writes Galatians, certainly there's a problem in the church. And this is true in almost all of his epistles. And they said that unlike these other epistles of Paul, Romans is not written for any particular occasion, any particular problem to address. That is to say, in the church. It's more impersonal, it's more generic, it's more like a treatise. Perhaps a little bit more like the book of Hebrews. Now, of course, Hebrews has a problem that's addressing too, but Hebrews is written as a sort of a theological treatise. And so most commentators treat Romans as a theological treatise, not as what we would call an occasional epistle. Occasional means it's brought about to address something, some occasion has occasioned it. There's something that happened in the church that caused Paul to write to the Corinthians or to the Galatians or whatever. And so I having been taught by the commentators and having read Romans through that grid myself for many years, I had assumed the same, that Paul is not really addressing any current problem in the church in Rome. He's simply writing something that will clarify his doctrine. Usually what was said was that because Paul had never been to Rome at the time he wrote it, which is in fact true, and since he was planning to go to Rome soon after this, which was also true, that he thought he'd send the letter on ahead maybe to familiarize them with the doctrine that he preaches so that it wouldn't take them by surprise. And so he's basically kind of sending ahead his notes for preaching, you know, so that the church will have some forewarning, some orientation, some foundation for hearing him preach. But that was the only reason for sending the letter. Now, I no longer believe that's the case. I believe that the letter was occasioned by a very specific problem in the church in Rome. And once I began to see it that way, I began to see everywhere in the epistle that it is an argument for something to address a problem that is in the church. We're going to be talking about it from that viewpoint. I'll also let you know what the more standard viewpoint is. Basically, to tell you the truth, most of the passages in Romans mean the same thing no matter which paradigm you look at. But there are some passages that have a different shade of meaning, if you're looking at it as I'm suggesting. So I'll let you know both ways to understand it, and I'll tell you what my way is that I think is correct, and you can make up your own mind. You are, after all, studying it for yourself, and should not be dependent on lecturers to interpret it for you ultimately. Let me tell you a little bit of background about the epistle before I talk about the occasion. The church in Rome, which Paul is writing to, as I said, he had never visited. In fact, we don't know if any apostles had ever visited it at this point. He was probably writing, well, you know, there's difference of opinion. Most would say in the winter between 56 and 57. Some say the winter between 57 and 58. And I've encountered a few scholars who would say as early as 55. So let's just say the late 50s. And probably 57 is a very good suggestion. After all, most commentators would say either 56, 57, or 57, 58. 57 is the common denominator. So we're going to just work with 57 to compare with other dates, all right? Now, we don't know how early the church in Rome started, since we don't know how it started. It's one of the few churches that did not appear to have been started by an apostle's visit. So, how did it start? Well, let me first of all deal with the tradition that it was founded by an apostle's visit. The Roman Catholic Church believes that St. Peter, as they would call him, I would call him the Apostle Peter, that he went to Rome and founded the church there and became the first bishop of Rome. And of course, according to Roman Catholic doctrine, every bishop of Rome since Peter wears Peter's mantle, sits on the seat of Peter, and has the authority Peter had, and that's where they get the idea of the Pope having a special authority in the church, because he's the Bishop of Rome. But the idea that Peter founded the church in Rome is not realistic. For one thing, in the year 50 AD, there was the Jerusalem Council in Jerusalem, and Peter was still there. I mean, Peter had made some excursions out to places like Caesarea to convert Cornelius and things like that. He'd gone to Samaria to see what Philip had done. He'd visited Antioch, we know, because Paul talks about Peter's visit to Antioch. Peter had gone out on some excursions, but his home base was in Jerusalem as late as the year 50. But the church in Rome existed before the year 50. We know this because there's a statement in Scripture and in a Roman historian named Suetonius that says that Emperor Claudius, around the year 49 or 50, banished all the Jews from Rome. Now this is mentioned by Acts chapter 18. When Paul came to Corinth, he met Priscilla and Aquila. They were Jews who had formerly lived in Rome, but it says they were banished from Rome when Claudius banished all the Jews from Rome. Now, Claudius' decree was not specifically targeting the Christian Jews, but there were Christian Jews like Priscilla and Aquila, and there were non-Christian Jews. Claudius, the emperor, simply wanted to get rid of the Jews from Rome because there were, as Suetonius, the Roman historian tells us, a lot of riots among the Jews, which were occasioned by somebody that Suetonius calls Chrestus, which Chrestus is very similar to the Greek word Christus, which is Christ. And no one named Chrestus is known from history. So almost all scholars agree that Chrestus was the way that Suetonius was modifying the name Christus, Christ. So Suetonius says that because of constant riots in Rome, occasioned or instigated by Chrestus, Claudius issued a decree to banish all the Jews from Rome. Now, we can easily see a backstory that would make sense of that, because we know that wherever the gospel is preached among the Gentiles, the main opposition it received was from the Jews in the synagogues. Now, we know this happened to Paul, although he was not the one who caused these problems in Rome. He had not been there yet. But we know where Paul went. When he preached in Gentile cities, he preached in the synagogues, and it was the synagogues that reacted violently. It was they that stirred up the people to stone Paul and drag him out of Lystra. They drove him out of Thessalonica. They drove him out of Corinth. So you know, Paul, and frankly, when Paul went to Jerusalem the last time, a Jewish riot there almost killed him, and he got put in prison and was taken from Jerusalem and never returned, as far as we know. The Jews were always violently reacting to the preaching of the gospel. And therefore, although Paul had not come to Rome yet, somebody had. If these riots were happening over the subject of Christ, someone was preaching Christ in Rome as early as 49 AD, and Peter was still in Jerusalem as he was in the Jerusalem Council in the 50 AD. But who took the gospel to Rome? Nobody really knows. One theory is that after the day of Pentecost, some of the visitors to Jerusalem, some of the pilgrims who'd come there for Pentecost, got saved among the 3,000 that were converted on the day of Pentecost, and went back to Rome, where they lived. Because Acts chapter 2 does mention that the people who heard the apostles preach and marveled at the speaking in tongues and so forth in Acts chapter 2, they were from many countries. 15 are mentioned. Rome is one of the places they were from. So you'd expect that pilgrims from Rome who go to Jerusalem for a festival, they don't just relocate and stay in Jerusalem, they go back to Rome eventually. But if some of them heard the gospel and were converted, they may very well have gone back to Rome and preached the gospel to their friends and started up spontaneous house churches. And as these would expand, then they would cause dissension between the Christians, especially any Jewish Christians, who got saved and the Jewish people who didn't. And we know that kind of thing was a dynamic that occurred in many places in the empire. No, it's not hard to imagine it happened in Rome, and that would occasion Claudius saying, I don't know what the problem is with these Jews, just get them all out of here. I don't like this, you know, these rebellions, these riots and so forth. So the Jews were expelled from Rome. That's going to be important for us to know when we think about what's going on in the Church of Rome when Paul wrote his letter, though he wrote it much later. Now, it's possible that some of the pilgrims from Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 took the gospel to Rome. It's also possible that some other way it was evangelized. After all, we read in Acts chapter 11 that when Stephen had been stoned in Jerusalem, Christians from, was stoned in Jerusalem, excuse me, when Stephen was stoned, that Christians in Jerusalem scattered all over the place, all over the empire. And they preached the gospel wherever they went. That's how the church of Antioch got founded. That's how the church in Samaria that Philip founded got started. That's apparently how all the churches outside Jerusalem got started. Because the church in Jerusalem was the only church for apparently some years until this persecution broke out over Stephen's death. And then Christians scattered many places. And some of them easily could have gone to Rome and could have preached there. So there's more than one realistic possibility of how the gospel would have gotten to Rome, but one of the ones that does not seem to be on the list is that Peter went to Rome and preached there, or any other apostle. The apostles were still pretty much in Jerusalem at the time when the Jews were banished from Rome. And the Jews were banished from Rome because there were Christians there. There was a church there. Now the church, it's interesting, in the end of Romans chapter 16, as you can see, that Paul sends greetings to a great number of friends of his that he knows. Now, he has not been to Rome, but Rome was a center of the empire, and people traveling on business or for other reasons would pass through Rome, as Paul himself was intending to do on his way to Spain, or would do business in Rome. And therefore, many people that Paul had met in other places were in Rome at the time that he wrote the letter, and he greeted many of them by name. And although he greets a great number, he does not greet Peter, which would be a significant omission if Peter was in fact the bishop in the Church of Rome or was in Rome at all. Paul knew Peter, they were friends, and he doesn't greet him. So if Paul wrote this, let's say in 57 AD or thereabouts, it would appear that Peter was not in Rome even then. We know he wasn't in 50 AD when he was at the Jerusalem Council. Apparently even 7 years later he was not. Now, according to tradition, he did go to Rome eventually, or in the 60s he was crucified, Peter was, upside down by Nero. And Nero was the emperor when Paul wrote but Peter was apparently not in Rome yet. Now, the Roman church apparently did not have church buildings yet, no cathedrals, and apparently no church buildings. It would appear that the church in Rome, as in many other places, met in homes. We find in chapter 16, Paul sending greetings, especially to the church in the home of his friends Priscilla and Aquila. Now this is interesting because he had met Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth because they had been banished by Claudius from Rome, and now they're back in Rome. So we have to assume that after Claudius died, which was 54 AD, that many of the Jews, perhaps most, who had been scattered and had been driven out of Rome, went back. At least Priscilla and Aquila did. And we read in Romans chapter 16, as the chapter opens, or near the beginning, in verse 3, he says, "Greet Priscilla," he says Prisca, that's short for Priscilla, "and Aquila, who work with me in Christ Jesus and who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Greet also the church in their house." So we know there was a church in the house of Priscilla and Aquila, but the number of Christians in Rome apparently was too great to really all meet in one house. And so there seem to be allusions to other house churches. Now, he doesn't use the word house in these other allusions, but there's some reason to suspect that that's what he's referring to. If you look at, for example, verse 10, Romans 16:10, that is. He says, "Greet Apelles, who is approved in Christ. Greet those who belong to the family of Aristobulus." Now, the word family is not in the Greek. It just says those of the household of Aristobulus, which would include his family, but there could be a house church there. And the next verse, "Greet my relative Herodion. Greet those in the Lord who belong to the household of Narcissus." And so some feel there are house churches in the house of Aristobulus and the house of Narcissus from these two verses. And then later on in chapter 16, in verse 14, it says, "Greet Asyncritus, Phlegon, Hermes, Patrobas, Hermas, and the brothers and sisters who are with them." And the following verse, verse 15, "Greet Philologus, Julia, Nerus and his sister, and Olympus, and all the saints who are with them." Now, he's talking about, he lists some people, and then there's other saints who are with them. Well, all these people are in the same Roman Christian church. But there are some who are with certain people, which may well speak of those separate congregations and separate houses. It's not important for us to settle the question. We know that there was at least one house church in the house of Priscilla and Aquila, and it may well be there were 5, based on some of these statements, depending on how they're interpreted, and depending on how big the church was. You have to realize that even if there were 5 house churches, they were all one church. God doesn't recognize multiple churches in a town. We know this because Paul writes to the church in Corinth. Even though the people in Corinth were dividing up, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, Paul only saw one church in the town. There was one church in Philippi. There was one church in Thessalonica. There's one church in Colossae. Later on, when the book of Revelation is written, there's one church in Ephesus, one church in Smyrna, one church in Thyatira, and so forth. So, although churches many times were too large, no doubt, to all meet with one congregation, all the congregations at one time were one church. And by the way, that's a little different than the way things are seen now. And the way we have churches now is not scriptural, in the sense that although there may be many congregations in one town, they aren't seeing each other as part of one movement. The Presbyterian Church is part of a global Presbyterian movement. The Baptist Church is part of a global Baptist movement. The Assembly of God Church is part of a global Assembly of God Church. The Methodist Church is part of a global Methodist movement. And they can all be on one street and they don't have anything to do with each other, but they're related to networks of churches all over the world that are more like them. So this is a very different development from, they didn't have, 5 churches in Rome all answerable to different networks and not to each other. There's only one church in the town. So Paul expected that while there may be many congregations, all of them would read the same letter. they would all recognize him as an apostle and would all be interested in what he had to say. So he writes in chapter 1, it says, to all the saints, all those who are in Rome who are called saints. And as far as the demographics of the church in Rome, Paul speaks to the church in Rome as if they are a Gentile church. In chapter 1, he mentions that he has an obligation to reach all the Gentiles. And in verse 13 he says, I want you to know, brethren and sisters, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as I have among the rest of the Gentiles. Paul's ministry is largely to the Gentiles. He wants to reap fruit among the Gentiles, the ones in Rome, as well as elsewhere, he says. In chapter 11, verses 13 and 14, he obviously is assuming Gentile readers when he says in chapter 11, verse 13, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I'm an apostle of the Gentiles, I glorify my ministry in order to make my own people jealous and thus save some. So he says, I'm speaking to you Gentiles. Obviously, he assumes it to be a Gentile congregation, predominantly. And it would be, of course. In chapter 15, verses 15 through 16, Paul says, nevertheless, on some points, I've spoken to you rather boldly by way of reminder because of the grace given to me by God to be a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles in the priestly service of the gospel of God, so that the offering of the Gentiles may be acceptable by the Holy Spirit. So I'm speaking to you as a church because God's given me a special calling to speak to the Gentiles. So we see that Paul is viewing this Rome as a Gentile church, just as almost all the churches Paul went to were Gentile churches. Nonetheless, it's clear there were Jews in them. Priscilla and Aquila, we've already found, were there. Many of Paul's friends from other places who were of the circumcision were in the church. And we can see there are times in the epistle when Paul actually addresses the Jews in the church separately from the Gentiles. In chapter 2, verse 17, he says, if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast of your relation to God, and goes on. He's assuming there are persons in the church who call themselves Jews, and no doubt they are Jews. In chapter 4 and verse 1, he says, what then are we to say was gained by Abraham, our ancestor according to the flesh? Abraham, our ancestor according to the flesh. Now, he might say to the Christians, no matter what race they were, Abraham's our spiritual ancestor. We're his spiritual offspring because we have the faith of Abraham. And he would talk that way in Galatians, but here he talks about he's our ancestor according to the flesh, which means he's talking to Jewish people who have Abraham as their actual ancestor. And then in chapter 7, verse 1, he says, do you not know, brothers and sisters, for I'm speaking to those who know the law, who know the Torah. Now, of course, some Gentiles would know something of the Torah, but those who know the Torah best would be, of course, the Jews. And it's clear that this church then was predominantly a Gentile church, but with a significant Jewish element. Now, this is what gave rise, in my opinion, to the need for Paul to write the letter. In my opinion, Paul is writing because there is division between the Jews and the Gentiles in the church. Why would that be? It has a lot to do with the fact that Claudius had expelled the Jews. Now, the church before Claudius expelled the Jews, in the 40s, would have been both Jew and Gentile in constituency. But when the Jews, Christian and non-Christian Jews, were all expelled from Rome by Claudius, that would leave only Gentile Christians for several years. At least 4 years, because Claudius didn't die until 54. And after his death, it might have taken a while for Jews to filter back from other places to go back to Rome, who had lived there before. But in the years that the Jews had been gone, the church would probably have taken on a very Gentile culture. Why would the Gentiles, who are not under the law, practice circumcision, run their churches like synagogues? I mean, the Jewish Christians sometimes did that kind of thing. But when the Jews were all gone for several years, the church would have certainly begun to be lax about this, which is no doubt why Paul says in Romans chapter 14 that in the church there were some who wanted to keep one day holy and some didn't. No doubt, that's Romans 14:5, no doubt the Jews would be, though the Jewish Christians would be the ones more inclined to want to still keep the Sabbath day. The Gentiles, they didn't grow up keeping Sabbath. It's not a Christian observance, it's a Jewish observance, so they probably wouldn't do it. Likewise with the diet problems. At the beginning of Romans 14, Paul talks about there are some in the church who want to keep a kosher diet. Well, he doesn't say they want to keep a kosher diet, he says they eat only vegetables. Now technically that's not what a kosher diet requires. Jews don't have to eat only vegetables. That's Seventh-day Adventists. The Jews eat a lot of meat, but they don't eat unclean meat. And in a Gentile city, many times a Jew who is very devout would not be able to be sure whether the meat he was eating was clean. I mean, he could certainly know whether it was pork or not, but he wouldn't know necessarily if it was the remnants of meat that had been sacrificed to an idol or not. Because there were idol temples in every pagan city, including Rome, and animal sacrifices were made there just as they were in the temple in Jerusalem. And, as in Jerusalem, some of the meat sacrificed to the god would be burned on the altar or eaten by the priest, but the rest would be, in the case of pagan temples, they'd sell it to those who sell meat at the meat market. So that it's, as often as not, if you find pieces of meat for sale in the market, these could be the remnants of an animal that was sacrificed to another god. And that was a problem in Corinth. That was probably a problem in Rome also. Jews, they probably got well to avoid this, or even to make sure that the meat was properly drained. The Jewish people had to drain all the blood out of meat. Most people don't do that. And so, eating meat in a pagan land it'd be questionable for a Jew who's trying to keep kosher. Maybe the blood hasn't been drained out. Maybe it's a remnant of the animal sacrificed to idols. Maybe it's been kept in contact with other animals. Maybe it's a cow, but maybe it was in contact with pigs. We don't know. I mean, so I would think the Jews, in many cases, the most devout ones, would just say, well, we'll just not eat animal foods. We'll just eat vegetables. That's what Daniel decided to do when he was in a pagan land, Babylon. He just thought, well, to avoid eating unclean foods, I'll just eat vegetables. Remember that. That's in the first chapter of Daniel. So that's what probably some of the Jews were doing in Rome, including some of the Jewish Christians. So Paul says, one man eats all things. Another man whose conscience is weak eats only vegetables. This is no doubt, again, a difference between the Jew and the Gentile in the church. We have those divisions in the churches today. Maybe not the church you attend, but there are messianic churches and messianic synagogues where the people in them want to keep kosher and they want to follow Jewish customs. For some reason they think that's better. Paul didn't think it was better. Therefore I don't think God thinks it's better. But the truth is that some people do think that's better. And even though 85% of the people who go to these Jewish synagogues, these Messianic synagogues, are Gentiles who are simply infatuated with all things Jewish, and relatively few Jews go to them, but they want to keep the Jewish ways. And the Jewish Christians in Rome probably were similar. The Gentile Christians saw that was nonsensical. That's legalistic. Come on, move on, And so this seems to be a matter of tension between them. You can see Paul saying to the church members in Romans 14, you who eat all things, don't despise the one who doesn't. And you who don't eat all things, don't judge those who do. Yeah, obviously there's strife here between these two cultures, the Jewish and the Gentile, which are both in the church. And we find a lot of Paul's early chapters addressed specifically to the Jews. And in chapter 11, he addresses specifically the Gentiles. He says, you're saved by faith, and these Jewish branches were broken off the tree, and you Gentiles have been grafted in, but don't boast against them. Don't be proud, because, just as they were broken off, you can be broken off. The point is that Paul seems to be addressing a church that does have a problem. He's not writing just a general, dispassionate, generic theological treatise. He's addressing a problem in the church just like he does in all of his epistles. And until we understand that, certain elements of his argument will not fit into the proper slot in your thinking. So I'm going to take that as what I believe to be the case. That's my assumption right now. And that's even going to have a lot to do with my newer understanding of Romans 2:14 about the Gentiles who have the law in their hearts and so forth. Now, you've studied Galatians already, is that correct? Obviously, Galatians is one of the earliest epistles of Paul, maybe the earliest. You notice as you now study Romans, there's a lot of the same themes that you find in Galatians. Sometimes scholars will say Galatians is like a rough draft of Romans. You can see that a great number of the same themes are covered, but more briefly. And Romans seems to be an expansion on it. Now, that doesn't mean that Paul wrote Galatians intending to write Romans. That he wrote Galatians and said, this will be my rough draft. I'll send this inferior document to the Galatians. I'll write the really good one for the Romans. But rather that he wrote these subjects hastily to the Galatians, and briefly. But as he had more time to frame the same ideas in a longer epistle to the Romans, he wrote Romans on the same topics, largely. Now, there are differences between Galatians and Romans, one of which is Galatians is a very passionate and personal epistle. Paul's very angry at certain people when he writes Galatians. He wishes they be castrated, he says. He wishes that they be anathema. Those who preach another gospel, it's a perversion of the true gospel. Let them be anathema, he says. He reminds the Galatians of his visit to them and how he'd been sick and how they had treated him so hospitably and why they changed their attitudes. Very personal stuff in Galatians. Romans is very impersonal. It's the most impersonal letter Paul wrote, with the exception of chapter 16, where he greets a lot of friends of his in Rome. He doesn't really mention in the book of Romans other people he knew in Rome. Except in the latter part of chapter 15, he doesn't talk much about his own self at all. He does in the latter part of chapter 15 talk about his travel plans. But the bulk of Romans could be seen as a treatise without any personal references at all. It's the most impersonal of his letters, but that could be because he didn't know that church intimately. He had friends who were there, maybe temporarily passing through Rome at the time or settled in, but it wasn't his baby. Galatian churches were his baby. They were his children in the faith. When he saw a wolf coming after his sheep, he responded, emotionally. Romans, I don't think he's seen so much of the same problem. He's not seen the Judaizers, but the whole understanding of the proper relationship of Jewish law to the gospel is still an issue because of these differences in culture and convictions between the Jewish and the Gentile members of the church. That's what I understand to be going on here. So he's got the same issues, but there's not the same danger, perhaps, and there's not the same connection emotionally with these people that he had with the Galatians, who he had led to the Lord himself. These people, perhaps very few, except maybe the ones he mentions in chapter 16, were any converts of his. So you're going to find similarities and dissimilarities between the epistle to the Galatians and the one to the Romans. Obviously, the epistle to the Romans is much more thought out, much more explained. Yes, Jesse?
One question I had, when you were talking about the church before the expulsion from Rome,
Yeah.
how are we certain that there were Gentiles there? Because it seems like Gentile inclusion, didn't really come about until a little bit later in the church. It kind of spread out from Antioch and Jerusalem with Peter.
Yeah.
And obviously Paul was going around preaching Gentile inclusion. But would that same idea have gone to Rome?
So the question is, how do we know that there were even Gentile Christians in Rome before Claudius expelled the Jews? Maybe it's just a Jewish church prior to that. That's what you're saying. I suppose we don't know for certain that there were any Gentiles in the church before that time because we have no record of any kind about the church prior to that. It's simply Claudius' decree that lets us know there were Christians there at all. But let's put it this way, if the church was all Jews and they were all expelled, then there'd be no church in Rome at all for the years the Jews were absent. And how there would then be a significant number of Gentiles, even predominantly, see it as a Gentile church, less than 5 years after the Jews have all come back, It's hard to say. Maybe the Jews who came back converted the Gentiles, and the first Gentiles came to the church after the Jews came back. But I think not, because then the Gentiles would have been converted into a more Jewish culture type of Christianity, it seems to me. In other words, the whole Gentile element would have been converted on the assumption you get circumcised, you keep kosher, you observe Sabbath and things like that. The fact that the Gentiles did not seem to have any interest in those things suggests that their conversion was not accomplished by the Jewish Christians who were hung up on those things. So I mean, you may be right, but actually, everywhere Paul preached, and Rome was not one of those places, but everywhere Paul preached, he started in the synagogues, but generally, the Jews in the synagogues rejected him, and then the Gentiles came in large numbers. So whoever first came to Rome prior to Peter or Paul being there, and whoever was a Christian began to convert people. It may be their first converts were Jewish, but Gentiles may have started coming in too. We don't know. There's a big gap in our knowledge of how the church got started and so forth. So I mean, if somebody wanted to say, well, I don't believe there were any Gentiles in the church before Claudius expelled them, I guess I couldn't prove them wrong, but it seems to me less likely, since that would mean there'd be no church at all in Rome. I keep saying Jerusalem, I think, but Rome is one church. There'd be no church at all in Rome while the Jews were absent then, and I don't think that's likely given the size of the church and the condition of the church a few years later, and the primarily Gentile composition of it would appear. So that would be one point that could be a sticking point for some people. I don't think it is for anyone I know, but it could be. It's can't be proven that there were Gentiles there before that, but it seems most likely. Yes?
Where does the Roman Catholic Church's view that St. Peter founded the Roman Church come from?
Where did the Roman Catholic view that Peter founded the Roman Church come from? It comes up, centuries after the Apostles' time. There was a development in the first several centuries of the church where certain churches became more influential because they were bigger, especially the Church of Rome, because it was in the capital of the empire. The leaders in Rome were sometimes consulted, like Clement of Rome in the first century was consulted by the Corinthian church about an issue they had. And so the Catholics, as I see, the Corinthian church saw the Roman church as, the ruling church. Well, not necessarily. Clement didn't say that. He's just writing from the Roman church to correct something in the Corinthian church. A person from any church could have written it. He happened to be in Rome. We don't know. Certainly there's no evidence in the book of Acts that the Church of Rome had any particular standing. It was the Church of Jerusalem, really, until 70 AD. That seemed to be the mother church. But when Jesus said to Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church, Roman Catholics would say, well, Jesus is saying he's going to build the church on Peter. And since the church eventually was all kind of looking to Rome for direction, just because it was a politically influential venue for the church, especially after Constantine was converted, and Constantine was the emperor in Rome, then the bishops in Rome and the priests in Rome and so forth began to have privilege and rise to somewhat more power. It was a gradual thing. It was eventually Augustine, around 400, who said that all the bishops of the churches should submit to the Bishop of Rome. So Augustine is thought to be the father of Roman Catholicism, but there's no actual historical evidence of it. Okay, so it's more an attempt to make Rome the center of political power for the church. And since Jesus said he builds church on that rock, whom they take to be Peter, they say, well, if Peter was the Bishop of Rome, then the Bishop of Rome has Peter's authority. They say Peter was the authority over all the apostles. There's no evidence of that in Scripture. Peter was rebuked by Paul in Galatians chapter 2, because Peter didn't say, hey, how dare you rebuke me, I'm your superior. He wasn't. basically the whole thing rose up after the church had come to be more politically organized. The early church, the bishops weren't exercising authority, because Jesus said, the rulers of the Gentiles exercise authority over people, but it shall not be so among you. He that be chief among you must be the servant of all. So in the early church, being a bishop wasn't a privilege. It was probably meant you had a target on your back at times of persecution. You're the first one to be fed to the lions. But eventually, when Constantine became a professed Christian and Christianity became respectable in the Roman Empire, then many leaders of the church could not resist the temptation to seize a political kind of power over the church. And I don't know, it's an evolving thing. But it doesn't have historical support. Peter was apparently not in Rome at the time of his founding, nor a considerable time after. When Paul wrote Romans, Peter does not seem to have been there because Paul didn't greet him. All right, now let me just tell you two paradigms. We have to take a break here, but two paradigms of understanding Romans. I'll tell you first of all how I learned it, how almost every commentary I know teaches it. They won't give the outline identically in every case, but the idea is that Paul's writing an evangelistic tract, a doctrinal treatise about the gospel. And that the first 11 chapters, and I'll agree with this part, the first 11 chapters are theological, whereas the last chapters, 12 through 16, much more of the practical nature. And I don't know how many of the books of Paul you've studied already, but you'll find that in many cases, in the case of Galatians, in the case of Ephesians, in the case of Colossians, Paul spends several chapters speaking theologically, and then it saves the end of the book for giving practical instructions that arise out of the theology of the earlier chapters. So that half of Colossians is theological, the first two chapters, and the other half is practical, the last two chapters. Half of Ephesians is theological, the first three chapters. Half of it is practical, the last three chapters. In Galatians, you've got two chapters of autobiography at the beginning, then you have two chapters of theology, and then two chapters practical. But the point is that this practical and theological almost get equal time in some of these shorter epistles, not in Romans. In Romans, it's 11 chapters of theological explanations, followed by, obviously, 5 chapters of practical. And one of those chapters is just greetings, so it's not that practical. So Paul has a much smaller percentage of Romans devoted to practical than to theological. And that's probably why it's easy to see Romans as primarily a theological treatise. But it is theological. It's just, I believe, theological written to address a certain problem in the church. But many, as I said, would say not. They see the theological portion, the first 11 chapters, is divided up this way. The first 8 chapters are a major section, and then there's Romans 9 through 11. Now, Romans 9 through 11, as you probably know, I'm sure you've read it recently, is about the Jews. Why have not the promises to Israel been seen to be fulfilled? And Romans 9 through 11, which is the last part of his theological section of the book, the last 3 chapters of the theological portion, is discussing that. And that's a fascinating discussion, which will, of course, I look forward to talking about. But before that discussion is the first 8 chapters. And most people think that the first 8 chapters is just a very great logical outline of the facts of the gospel. And it starts out by proving the universal sinfulness of man. And according to the most common understanding, chapter 1 establishes the sinfulness of the Gentiles. Chapter 2 establishes the sinfulness of the Jews, equal with the Gentiles. And chapter 3 kind of summarizes that both the Jews and the Gentiles, everybody, is lost. There's none, that does good, no, not one. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So you've got established in the first 3 chapters the universal sinfulness of humanity, and then chapters 4 and 5 are seen as putting a finer point on the issue of justification by faith and not by law, or specifically not by circumcision. And I won't go into the details now because we're going to take a break, but then chapters 6 through 8, which many people say are their favorite chapters in the Bible, are thought to be about sanctification, how we overcome sin, and particularly chapter 8 about the power of the Holy Spirit, which dominates that chapter. But that you've got, therefore, the establishment of the sinfulness of all men in the first 3 chapters, an exposition on justification by faith in chapters 4 and 5, and then chapters 6 through 8 are pretty much about sanctification and walking in holiness and walking in the Spirit. And after that, there's the discussion of the Jews in chapters 9 through 11, and then the practical section, which begins in chapter 12, verse 1, where Paul says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, meaning by the mercies of God we've been discussing in the first 11 chapters, in view of those theological truths, I beseech you to do something practical. Present your body as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So, Paul then goes into the practical application. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you is the outline is not altogether bad. I just see some of the parts of it differently. I believe that in the first 4 chapters, Paul is specifically addressing Jewish snobbery. The Jews, as we shall see, believed that they were special before God, not because they lived better lives, but because they had a covenant that goes back to Moses' time, and they are circumcised, and keep the Sabbath, which is the sign of the covenant. And anyone who's not circumcised, that would mean all the Gentiles usually, was a lesser breed without the law, almost subhuman. Now they acknowledge, Christian Jews, they acknowledge that Gentiles would be Christians too. But they really tended to think that Gentiles, because they're not circumcised and don't keep the ceremonial laws, are lesser Christians, which is again what Paul has to address here. And I believe the first 4 chapters is how he addresses it, as we'll see. Chapters 5 through 11 are still in the theological portion, but I think that they are chapters that Paul uses to clarify some of the points, to put finer points on some of the points he made in the first 4 chapters. And that includes chapters 9 through 11, where he talks about the Jews, which is part of the whole discussion. It's not a separate one. See, I used to think that Paul talked about the gospel up through chapter 8, then he kind of turned a sharp right and talked about something entirely different, the Jews, for 3 chapters. And I don't see that anymore. I think his discussion of the Jews fits perfectly into his general concern here. So, as far as the latter part, the practical sections, I would see them largely the same way as the other view sees them. So it's not a majorly different approach, but probably where I differ most is with the standard paradigm is in the first 4 chapters. So what Paul's really saying, I believe it's directed toward the Jews. Whereas again, the standard view is chapter 1's toward the Gentiles, chapter 2's toward the Jews, and chapter 3's toward all people. And we're going to look at those carefully to see why I would today challenge that paradigm. But we'll take a break now, 15 minutes, and we'll come back and do chapter 1 and maybe more. Okay.
And we have it's a very special day. We're going to have a lot of celebrations today.